Are we on with this? This working? Okay, that's good. That's good. Feels kind of like I'm moving in for the weekend here, but all this stuff. But uh, before I get started, or as we get started, I want to see if I can get a little assistance from uh, from somebody. But I'm just trying to find the right person to do this. But let me see. Oh, can you hear it? I'm sorry. It was on before, yeah. Which is it? Oh, okay. I didn't want to put it in my mouth. I thought that might be too good, but anyhow. So let me ask Adam. Let me ask you a question, if this is okay. Just for a little group participation. What what color would you say this is? Yeah. But it's pretty much. Would you say it's white? Everybody agree with that? Pretty much. Anybody have a disagreement with that? That's white, basically. Does that look like? Okay. Now, Adam, let's try another test here. This question number 2. What color would you say this is? Yeah. Well, actually, it's kind of, I think on this side, it's surely it's sort of brown, but on this side, it's mostly, hopefully, if you can tell, it's kind of hard with the light sometimes to tell, but does that look black to you, everybody? Pretty much? We've got agreement on those things? Okay. That wasn't too hard, was it? We start with the easy ones. We work up to the hard questions. But, let me see. Somebody have a favorite celebrity? A person that's well-known? Just give me a name. Who's a favorite? A favorite? I'm sorry. Chris who? Okay. I don't even know. I don't know who that is even. Well, okay. I'm sorry. Sean Connery. Okay, there's another one. Let's suppose Chris Pratt and Sean Connery both walked in here today. Walked right in here to this church building, and walked up here, and they said, and held up this right here, and they said, "This is black." What would you think if somebody said this is black? Somebody that you thought was pretty sharp or well known or Common Core. That's a new math or new education system, huh? So, so if somebody said this was black, and if they said this was white, we'd have some questions about that all, wouldn't we? We'd think that was a little strange, maybe, unusual, or we wouldn't understand exactly why that was. But um, what's interesting is that back in the 1920s, there was a fellow by the name of Adolf Hitler that many of you may have been familiar with or have heard of. And he wrote a book called Mein Kampf. This was actually before he ascended to power over in Germany. But he wrote a book called Mein Kampf. And in the book, one of the things he described, he talked about what he referred to as the big lie. And what he said essentially was that, if you were going to tell a lie, it didn't make any sense to just tell a little lie, because everybody does that. So if you're going to tell a lie, you need to tell a big one. And his notion was that if you tell a big lie long enough, you get a lot of people to believe it. And so when he ascended to power, guess what he did? He told actually more than one big lie, but one of the big lies that he told people, that he told the German people back in those days. Some of you may can remember this from history, but one of the things that he told people was that he told the Germans that they were a master race. He told them that they were basically supermen, and that all the other races or ethnic groups in the world were inferior in some way. The master group, the super group, and so and of course, obviously, he thought the Jews were so inferior that they needed to be exterminated, but they weren't actually the only ones. He wanted to exterminate also the Slavic people. So he had that notion. But when he first began to say stuff like that, I would imagine that the average German who heard somebody saying you're a Superman, you're part of a super race or a master race, they probably thought, well, I don't really feel all that super. I don't think I've ever leaped over a tall building with a single bound, and a lot of days I don't even feel like getting out of bed. So I don't feel all that super. But he kept saying this over and over, and there's something in all of us that likes to think that we're special, that we're just a little bit smarter, or a little stronger, or a little quicker, or a little this or that better than somebody else. And so somewhere after hearing this long enough that they were a master race and they were supermen, people started to believe that. And that's exactly what he'd said in Mein Kampf. If you tell a big enough lie long enough, you'll get some people to believe it. And so for him, of course, this was a way of establishing power and of being in control of those people to get them to do things that they otherwise would not have considered doing. Because he convinced them that they were a master race, he convinced them also that they should go out and try to conquer the rest of the world, to be in control of everybody else. We're living in an era. I'll see if this thing works. Is there a certain way to hold this, Nathan? There we go. Oh, went to. Okay. Isaiah 5 and verse 20. This is out of the NIV. God said through the prophet Isaiah, many years before Christ was even born, he said, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." I believe we're living in an era in which increasingly, just as the you say the contrast between white and black seems stark, and it seems like it's how could anybody be confused about such things or think this was black and this was white? But we're, I believe, living in an era where this very scripture is occurring, is being played out, if you will, increasingly, where people are actually calling good evil, and people are calling things that are evil good, or light for darkness, etc. So, and when you think about good and evil or light and darkness, those things really are opposite of one another. They you can't really have both of them at the same time. They're complete opposites, and you might think that people of goodwill will agree about some things that are fundamental like that. There are a lot of things we might have different opinions about, certainly, but we wouldn't have different opinions about what's right necessarily. We should be able to not have necessarily different opinions about what's really good or what's evil. But yet in these days, and I think in the times we're living in, that increasingly is called into question. And it's not necessarily about different opinions, but it's about an agenda of control by distorting perceptions, by distorting language, and sometimes even changing the definitions of words, and distorting the very reasoning process that we operate by. And so, and that's what's necessary to make all this work for somebody, because otherwise you'd say, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. A lie is always a distortion of the truth in some way. And actually, people do sometimes talk about little lies or big lies, but I don't think I've ever seen in the Bible where it really makes a distinction between little lies and big lies. It's just that a lie is always a distortion of what's true in some way. And even Satan, the adversary, when he was trying to tempt Jesus, would quote Scripture. But he didn't quote it exactly right. And you can take the very word of God and you can just twist it just a little bit, and it's not true because it's been distorted in some way. And so, that's any lie is going to be a distortion of the truth. And it's even if you go back to the very first to the first one that came into being that we are aware of, when Adam and Eve were in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, and the serpent comes along. And he says to Eve, who's standing there by the tree, gazing maybe a little bit too longingly at it, he says to her, what did God say about this? And so she tells him pretty much what God had said. The day that you eat of it, you're going to die. And so what did the serpent say to her? Said, you won't die. Well, so there you go. So it was, this distortion was really the exact opposite. When you have the truth and you have a lie together, you have to choose which one you're going to believe. And that's true for us as much as it was for Eve. Now, Eve, for some reason, chose to believe the lie rather than to believe the truth of what God had said to her. She chose to believe that. It found that appealing. But the lie is always going to be a distortion. And we have to choose what we're going to believe. Now, the interesting thing is, for most of us, again, calling evil good or good evil, most of us have a pretty good understanding. We've lived a while and we've understood these things. But if you really wanted to make a big lie work, you have to start mostly with young kids. If you can manage to control the educational influences that affect kids and young adults, you can begin to change how people perceive things. And in these days in which we live, not only the educational influences, but particularly the entertainment influences, because those are actually in some ways stronger than the educational ones. People are exposed to a lot of things through entertainment, through various forms of entertainment. And so if you can continue for the younger generation if you can continue to say enough times, this is black, this is white, pretty soon, people will start questioning. They'll say, that there's some people that don't think that, but those are just kind of the old fogies around there. They don't really understand that there's a new way of looking at it, and this really is black and that's white, and here's what's good and here's what's evil. And so that's kind of how things begin to be changed. What I'd like to submit to you today is that we're in essentially a battle. And we may or may not realize the battle that we're in, but it is a battle, and it's a battle really for hearts, for souls, and for minds more than anything else. And it's spoken of in Ephesians in 6 and verse 12. It's spoken of in this way. It says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." I put this one in the King James instead of the NIV because the NIV and this verse and another one we'll look at later uses the word rulers for principalities. And I think that really, the connotation that has for many of us, we have an idea of what a ruler is. And it seems we can make that sort of concrete in some ways. But principalities we don't use much. And so it doesn't make as much sense to us, probably in one sense. But our problem is that we tend to think that we're wrestling against flesh and blood. When we think of a wrestling match, in fact, if you think of a wrestling match right now, what do you think of? You think of some, probably, you get an image in your mind, you can just visualize, you can see some real large guys in an enclosed ring in their underwear trying to push each other around for one of them to push the other one down and to sit on him or something. Right? We've seen wrestling matches like that before. Well, you see, when I say God has called each one of us to wrestle, the good news is you don't have to get in this enclosed ring with a large sweaty guy in his underwear. You don't have to do that. That's not what God's called us to do. We're not called to wrestle with flesh and blood, but with principalities, powers. And when he talks about principalities, what that really means, it's a Greek word for principalities, and it's the Greek word arche. Arche, from which we get the English word, or the English prefix at least, arch, arch or ark, depending on what word you're talking about. If you were thinking of an archangel, that we pronounce it as ark. In some cases, we may pronounce it as arch, but it's that prefix. And what that literally means, it means chief. It means first, or beginning, first place, or first in rank. It's a chief. When we think of a principality, we're talking about a spiritual being, but we're talking about someone who is first in rank, who's a chief. And we may not think about this all that much, but we understand we have an adversary, Satan, who's an adversary. But it's not just about Satan. He has other spiritual beings to help him. We refer to them as demons, demonic forces, evil spirits. They're spoken of in the scripture many times that way. And so it's not just one being, but there are multiple beings that are adversarial to. They were adversarial to Jesus, and they're adversarial to us. And those the whole domain, if you will, of evil spirits has a government or a certain order to it, if you will. And so it's everybody's not the same, and all the evil spirits in the world are not exactly equal or not exactly the same. If you recall, Jesus one time approached a man who was actually living in a cave, didn't have any clothes on, would do strange, bizarre things. Nobody could handle or control him in any way. They just considered him kind of a wild man. And when Jesus was going to cast the demon out of him, the demon engaged him in conversation there for a minute because he was begging not to be cast out or not to be tormented. And so Jesus had a conversation, and he said to this demon, "What's your name?" And you remember what he said? He said, "My name is Legion." Remember that? Why? Because he said there was one voice coming forward, but he said because we're many. So obviously in some cases, demonic forces travel in groups and do their nasty business in groups. In other cases, you may have demonic beings who are just sort of really stubborn, I guess you might say. You remember when Jesus went up to the Mount of Transfiguration with James and John and Peter, took them along with him, and he came back from that Transfiguration experience. And he came back down, and there was somebody that immediately accosted him and said, "Look, I've got my son here that's throws himself in the fire, has seizures or whatever, and all these things." He said he's got some kind of a demon that's controlling him, and your disciples tried to cast the demon out. They couldn't do it. Remember what Jesus said? He said because the disciples came and said, "Lord," because he had given them authority prior to this to cast out demons. That was an authority that they had, and they had done it before. They weren't brand new at this. They'd been doing that a while. They said, "Why couldn't we do this?" And he said, because of your little faith. You didn't. There's some things, some of these things, these demonic forces that are so stubborn that it's going to take more than, you're going to have some real faith to push with this. There's a verse that's questionable. It's held out of some versions that says where he may have said to them that this one requires prayer and fasting. But the point of it is simply that there are some that are different from others. They're not all the same. And principalities, when he talks about, we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, but principalities, and I'm just focusing on that. There's 4 different categories here, but these chiefs, they're sort of like generals of an army, if you will. They've been around a long time, and they've learned how to have an effect. And this is really what we're called to battle, and what our battle is with. It's not with people, not with flesh and blood. There may be somebody that you can see that says things that you don't like or disagree with or whatever, but our battle isn't with them. It's with what's behind this. There are spiritual forces, principalities, chiefs, etc., that have an impact. Now, let me show you another verse over in 2 Corinthians. It says in chapter 10, it says, "For though," again, this is along the same lines, "for though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. By the way, do you know what a stronghold is? You know what a stronghold is? A stronghold is something that's got a strong hold on you. That's right. And there are things that sometimes can get a strong hold on us. They do. And this is where these demonic forces, principalities, verse 5, he goes on to say, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. The first part of that verse, over in the Old King, this is NIV, and over in the Old King James, it says casting down imaginations. But the word, whether you think of imaginations or arguments, the word actually in the Greek there is the word logismos. I can't even say it right now. Logistismos, it's got about 4 syllables. But at any rate, it's a word that literally means a line of reasoning. There's a line of reasoning that we need to demolish or cast down or put away that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. It's against God and the knowledge of God, and so this is what we were battling against. But when it says there, we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. The good news about that is that you don't have to. You really can't take somebody else's thoughts captive. See, Mike, you can't take Pam's thoughts captive, or she can't take yours captive, or I can't take Donna's thoughts captive. That's not the way it works. We're not called to control other people's thoughts, but we're called to take captive our own thoughts. And believe me, that's a big enough chore right there, because there's all kinds of thoughts that come into your brain, and they come from a variety of sources. But what we're called, in order to be able to demolish arguments, in order to be able to battle against principalities, we have to get our own thinking clear. And so the first part of that battle is taking into captivity our own thoughts to obedience of Christ. We've got to get our own thoughts lined up with what God has said, so that we can understand how to address the lies that are around us, and especially the biggest lies, the ones that are the largest of all. If we don't get our own thoughts, together, we have real trouble of doing that. So that's essential to what we've got to do. So what I'm saying essentially is that a demon may present a single lie to you to try to get you to believe something that's a deception, that's not true, but that a principality is presenting not just a single lie, but a whole line of reasoning. A whole line of reasoning is to try to get you off base. I'm going to give you an example of this, what I believe is a current example today. And you can judge for yourself the accuracy of this. One of the things, and I've just seen this just in the last year or two, as times are changing, as times continue to change. One of the things I've seen made reference to is the notion this has to do with the sex or gender of a person, that the sex or gender of a person is assigned at birth. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Sometimes you'll see this even in an ordinance. As people make ordinances and make changes in ordinances, they'll talk about the sex or the gender of a person, depending on which way you put that, the sex or gender that's assigned at birth. I hadn't seen this until just a year or two ago. But I don't know what all of you think about this, but and we all, when you have a baby, if you haven't done ultrasounds beforehand, the baby's born and you don't know what they're going to be until they're born. And so a baby's born and the doctor or the nurse or somebody says it's a boy or it's a girl, and they've managed to identify that. But let me assure you that the sex of that baby is not something that was assigned by a doctor in a delivery room, or a nurse, or a midwife, or whatever. Can you agree with that? It's not something that was just assigned at that point in time. That's essentially what their people are saying, because what that, and I'm not talking again. I'm not talking about equal rights or discrimination or any of those things today. What I'm just talking about is the line of reasoning that gets you where you come out. Because there are folks today who are essentially saying that you define your own identity, that you decide if you're a boy or if you're a girl. This seems kind of fundamental and basic. Most of us take this for granted that we've understood this as we've grown up, but but the notion that's currently being, again, that's being moved through our culture is the notion that you define it yourself, and you may not define it until some later point in life. So what I submit to you is that here's the choice that you've got. Who defines your identity? I'm talking about just your basic identity, but whether you're a male or a female. Who defines that? Do you define that yourself, or does God define that? Did God make a decision about that long before you were ever born, actually? Or is that something that you decide at some point after you're in this world and maybe you're not quite happy with things in your life, or you like to do some things differently or whatever, and so you look at it differently. If you define your own identity, if you believe, I'm just saying, if you follow this line of reasoning, if you define your own identity, then you pretty much have to eliminate God from the equation. There's not any room for him in there, you see. And so it gets back to the notion of if you start with something that's a big enough lie, and the lie in this case is that somehow the sex or gender of a person is defined at birth by somebody else, by a doctor, by a nurse, by somebody, that it's been assigned to you, and that you can change the assignment, kind of like you change an assignment at school. You know, that you can change the assignment if you think, well, I don't think this is what I am or who I am. I'm somebody else. And again, that's the only way that you can have that thought is the notion that, well, there isn't any God, because if God was here, then if there is a God, then he has a role in all this, in making these kind of decisions. And in fact, he does. Over in Psalm 139, starting in verse 14, it says, the psalmist writes, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. So, again, before we were born, God saw us, he knew us when we were still unformed. You know, there's and these days, actually, as far as the sex of a child, now some of you who are more recent, Emmeline or some others who've just had babies more recently, can tell me this. I know that they can do ultrasounds. 20 weeks, can they tell the sex of a baby? I don't know. Maybe even a little before that, I don't know. I'm not sure. Somewhere in there, Brad, you'd know this kind of stuff better than all of us probably. But somewhere in there you can tell. So it's long before a baby's born. You'll know whether they're male. If it's already been decided, basically, from the time that conception takes place and those first two cells get together, that decision is made, right? That's part. And so when you're still unformed, we all started off kind of unformed here in this whole process, and then we began to shape up as we got larger. But and we took shape. But before that, God saw us, and he knew exactly what we were going to be. He had a plan for you, and he had a plan for me to be the people that we are, and to be, of course, as we're born and emerge and get into life, he has a plan for us to be formed still further, to be formed into conformity into the image of Christ. And that's his longer-term plan for us. But initially, we're just who he's made us to be. So, in this wrestling that we're doing, to wrestle with principality, with spiritual leaders, we need to follow the example that Jesus has given us on the cross, and I'm going back to the King James Version here for this one, blotting out in verse 14 the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross, and having spoiled principalities and powers. He made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. This is Colossians 2. Again, this focuses on the fact that there were spiritual realities, there were spiritual chiefs, generals that were present at the time that Jesus was on the cross, and they wanted to have an influence on what was happening, but by virtue of what he did in going to that cross, he essentially spoiled those principalities. And the word spoil actually has two meanings to it. As it's used here from the King James, it means on the one hand, it means he put them off from himself. It means to put off from himself. And so, as in fact, he had, there were, again, the principalities were just, were those that directed a line of reasoning. There were literal people who came up to Jesus when he was hanging on the cross and said, he saved others, let him save himself. Again, that was based on trying to convince Jesus of a big lie. Wasn't what he was here for, to save himself, you see. So, but they were trying to, even at the moment that he was on the cross, still around him, speaking through people, if you will, suggesting that, saying to him, in addition to that, saying to him, if you're the Son of God, come down from that cross and we'll believe you. They said these things that were based on a big lie. Jesus didn't have anything to do with them. In fact, he didn't actually respond to those things. You know, the thing that he did say, the one thing that he did say wasn't to them. He directed his comments to the Father. He said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And he wasn't just talking about the people that nailed him to that cross. He was talking about all those people that had this, that were supporting that, and that were essentially saying to him that he should come down from that cross. So he was continuing to have forgiveness for the people but he wasn't responding, because he didn't need to respond to that. In that case, he didn't need to respond directly to those things they were saying. He spoiled principalities by putting them off from himself. He refused to believe those things. The second thing that spoiled means, it means to strip off or to unclothe. Jesus essentially, by virtue of the cross, he exposed those principalities for what they were. They were essentially espousing a big lie. They were essentially trying to convince people of a way of life that would always lead them to despair. If all you try to do is to save yourself, you're never going to find any success or happiness, or you're going to always be miserable. It leads you down totally the wrong path. And so he exposed them, and the thing of it is, just as Jesus did that on the cross, just as he both put off from himself and exposed these principalities for what they are, part of our wrestling with principalities and powers is we need to do that very same thing in this generation, in the generation in which we live. So, but it always comes back to the cross. It always comes back to the cross, you see. You have to remember, when you're tempted to fight, I heard a man say this years ago, when you're tempted to fight fire with fire, remember that the fire department uses water. That's always kind of stuck with me, because it just it makes a certain level of sense. But sometimes we're tempted, if somebody is aggravating to us, or if somebody says something that we consider to be ignorant or just we disagree with it, we want to get right in there and be mad at them and argue with them. And that's really not the way to accomplish the exposure of the principalities or the exposure of the faulty line of reasoning. It's not by being a great debater. It's not by being smarter than everybody else, but it is by demonstrating heavenly wisdom. And over in James, James chapter 3, starting in verse 14, it talks about the two different kinds of wisdom. It says, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, don't boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every evil practice. You know, there is a wisdom. There is a wisdom that is by wisdom I mean an ability to understand how to make your way around, how to navigate the world. There is a wisdom that's earthly, that's demonic, and it's this. It's based on essentially how do I get ahead? How do I step on somebody else to get where I want to go? And that's what selfishness and envy and selfish ambition are really about. And what they lead to, ultimately, some people can do that in ways that are much more hidden than others, but what they do is they lead to the same result. But the wisdom that comes from heaven, there is a wisdom from heaven, and that's first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So God's called us to have a wisdom that's heavenly, and again, for us to be able to wrestle effectively against principalities, it's not about being great debaters. It's not about being the sharpest tack in the room we don't have to be smarter than everybody else. God never said we had to be smarter than other people. But we need to have a wisdom, because wisdom isn't about being smarter necessarily, but it is about having a lifestyle, a way of living that's based on principles that come from heaven. To be considerate, to be sincere, to be impartial, to be full of mercy. We need to be continually full of mercy, to have good fruit that's just flowing out of our lives. When we do that, there's a commentary that steps forward that stands against all the faulty lines of reasoning, all the faulty sorts of thinking processes that come from principalities. And that's the kind of battle that we're called to be in. The important reason I say all this today is because we need to be sweet, but we need to be firm. We need to know that there are some things we can't compromise on, because at some point, when you have more and more people who are saying, this is black, you have to be able to stand up and say, no, that's not really black, that's white. That's what that is. So, and here's why it's white. And there's a reason why good is good and evil is evil. Because God is the one who's defining those terms, not you and me necessarily. We can define things in all kinds of different ways, but God has set before us what's really good and what's not good. So those are the thoughts I wanted to share with you today about the wrestling match that I believe that we're actually in. It gets more intense all the time. When Nathan asked me about a title for this, I said the wrestling match part 2, because I spoke a message like this, similar to this, 25 years ago to another group of people. But the wrestling match has gotten bigger and it's more intense. It really has. And the time that we live in, our calling really is to participate in this, to be part of it. We can't simply be passive observers of what's happening. We have to be active participants in the conversation that's taking place in our communities, with those around us, our neighbors, with people that we know, about these things, because we've got to essentially continue to allow God to speak through each one of us in a message of heavenly wisdom. We're going to stand and sing some songs now. If God is stirring your heart in any way, if you'd like to, Jerry's going to be at the back, and we'll pray with folks. If you'd like him to pray with you, to encourage you, please feel free to take that opportunity. I think, Nathan, you've got some songs to lead with. Why don't we just, if you'll stand up and we'll all sing together.